From the moment Father Thomas Thornton delivered his first sermon, the people of Havenwood sensed something different, something unsettling. His homilies were eloquent, yes, but devoid of warmth. He spoke of sin not as a burden to be lifted, but as a debt to be paid in full. His gaze lingered too long during confession, and his sermons grew increasingly obsessed with secrecy penance and divine surveillance. The 4 confessional booths constructed from imported walnut and adorned with gilded trim that seemed wildly out of place in a humble parish church were installed within a fortnight. But these were no ordinary booths. Each was fitted with a complex system of sliding panels and acoustical vents that allowed voices to be carried, recorded, even into a hidden chamber behind the altar. A chamber that no one aside from the Thornton brothers knew existed, for Father Thomas was not alone. A week after his arrival, 2 more men joined the parish under the guise of religious vocation. Brother Elias and Brother Matthew Thornton, introduced as his cousins, but in truth his younger brothers, both equally brilliant and equally dangerous. Elias, soft-spoken and perpetually robed in black, claimed to be a confessor of extraordinary sensitivity, able to perceive truth beyond mere words. Matthew, charming and sociable, worked among the townsfolk as a church steward, collecting tithes, organizing community events, and identifying those most vulnerable to spiritual persuasion. What began as holy service soon became a reign of ecclesiastical terror. Each confession given at St. Bartholomew's was transcribed, categorized, and stored. Sins of the flesh, financial fraud, secret affairs, hidden pregnancies, illicit trade deals. These weren't just whispers to be absolved, they were assets. Within 2 years, the Thornton brothers had compiled a black ledger so damning it could destroy every family of prominence from Havenwood to Baltimore. And they used it. A merchant who confessed to adulterating tobacco with molasses to increase weight soon found his warehouse mysteriously burned unless he offered a donation to the church and a promise of future obedience. A young girl who whispered of her master's nightly visits vanished her absence. Never discussed her name, never spoken again. But the Thorntons didn't just leverage secrets, they created them. Brother Elias, under the guise of spiritual counseling, planted doubts in the minds of the devout. He accused men of impure thoughts they hadn't confessed, demanded women fast for sins they hadn't committed. Under this psychological pressure, people began to break. They would confess anything, truth or fiction, just to earn peace. But peace never came. Only more control. And then the deaths began. At first they were quiet. An old farmer found hanging in his barn a bottle of sacramental wine at his feet. A widow dead in her bed, a rosary clutched in her hand, and black bile staining her lips. The church ruled them suicides. But the doctor, an Anglican, with no love for Catholic authority, suspected otherwise. He wrote letters, he made inquiries, he vanished. By 1740, the Thornton brothers controlled 12 parishes across southern Maryland. They built an invisible empire of fear, feeding off confession, absolving only those who served their ends and damning those who resisted. But their downfall, as with many tyrants, came not from the outside, but from within. And that, dear listener, is where we pick up in the next part of this story. Because the Thornton dynasty didn't just fall, they were erased systematically and with divine silence. Before we uncover how a single act of rebellion shattered decades of spiritual tyranny, hit that like button Share this tale with someone brave enough to face the dark history of the American colonies. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. Trust me, this descent is only just beginning. That same evening, while the church candle still flickered with the scent of incense and absolution, Father Thornton summoned a private visitor to the rectory. Richard Whitmore arrived, promptly unsure why he'd been called, but too devout and too afraid to question the priest's summons. He was greeted not with scripture or tea, but with silence and a single folded parchment placed carefully on the table between them. The paper bore no name, no seal, just a date written in an unfamiliar but elegant hand, April 17th, 1735. Whitmore's blood ran cold. It was the date he had promised Catherine he would return to Annapolis and finalize the purchase of her contract. The letter didn't accuse him. It didn't have to. It confirmed what he feared most someone knew. "You're a good man," Richard Father Thornton said at last, breaking the silence like a dagger into water. "But good men make mistakes. And when they do it is the duty of the church to ensure their redemption is properly managed." The message was clear. Richard Whitmore was no longer a merchant. He was a debtor, and the currency was obedience. Over the next 5 months, Whitmore found himself drawn deeper into the Thornton web. At first, the requests were framed as spiritual restitution donations to expand the church, anonymous gifts to struggling families, confidential assistance with the church's special projects. But soon Thornton's demands became darker. He was instructed to redirect shipments, delay rival merchants' deliveries, and fund anonymous land acquisitions with hidden ownership properties that slowly consolidated power in the hands of the church. By the autumn harvest, Richard Whitmore had become a shell of the man he once was. A trusted merchant by day, a reluctant agent of the Thornton machine by night. And he was just the beginning. Over the next 3 years, dozens more fell into the trap. A midwife who confessed to performing a secret abortion, a plantation owner whose books concealed profits from illegal trade, a young altar boy grappling with thoughts the church considered damnable. Each confession was catalogued, transcribed, and weaponized. But Father Thornton didn't just collect sin, he orchestrated it. Brother Matthew, ever the charming emissary of goodwill, would plant temptation where it was most effective. A loan offered in desperate times. A servant girl assigned to an unfaithful man's household. A whispered rumor passed between bitter neighbors. He didn't need everyone to sin. Just enough of them. Enough to ensure that guilt became a leash, and that the church held every tether. And when blackmail failed, there was always Brother Elias. It was Elias who handled irredeemables, those who could not be broken by fear or guilt. A quiet death from spoiled wine, a hunting accident in the woods, a sudden illness that swept through an entire household. The parishioners of Havenwood whispered that Father Thornton was blessed, that divine favor shielded the church from sickness and misfortune. In truth, it was Elias's poisons and meticulous methods that made sure the right people died at the right time. By 1740, the Thornton family had turned St. Bartholomew's into a fortress of silence, its parishioners into prisoners of their own guilt. And yet, despite their iron grip on Havenwood cracks, had begun to form cracks that would one day become fractures. One such crack came from the most unexpected place, a runaway indentured servant who'd once worked in the rectory's kitchen. Her name was Lydia Byrne, and she had seen more than she was ever meant to. But her story and the fateful journal she carried deserves its own chapter. Before we dive into Lydia's escape and the first real threat to the Thornton Dominion, make sure you're subscribed. These stories are buried deep, and only the most determined listeners will uncover them all. If you're still with us, drop a comment below. Do you believe secrets this dark could survive 3 centuries of silence? Because some sins don't stay buried forever. Within 6 months of Richard Whitmore's coerced donation, Father Thornton's fund had grown by over $300, an extraordinary sum in colonial Maryland, and none of it recorded in the parish's official ledger. Instead, the money was held in a private account managed by Marcus Thornton, funneled through shell entities and silent partnerships tied to Havenwood's tobacco trade. And still, the confessionals filled. At first, the victims were men wealthy, influential, guilty of sins that could ruin fortunes and families. But soon the Thornton net widened to include midwives, merchants' wives, apprentices, even priests from nearby parishes whose indiscretions were unearthed and used to ensure their silence. By 1738, Father Thornton had instituted a traveling ministry using his ecclesiastical influence to support struggling parishes across the colony. What this truly meant was a mobile system of surveillance and extortion. His nephews would visit churches under the guise of spiritual retreat, assess the congregation, and install a simplified version of the Havenwood confessional system, often in collaboration with local priests who had already been compromised. The church hierarchy, hungry for order in the unruly colony, and dazzled by Thornton's growing influence, never questioned his success. Parish attendance increased, donations surged, scandals quietly disappeared. From the outside, Father Thomas Thornton appeared to be a model of pastoral leadership, but beneath the surface, he was a spider at the center of a vast web of controlled secrets. Each confession became a thread, each sin a knot. And once you were caught in the web, there was no escape. In one chilling case, a young widower named Elias Donnelly confessed to accidentally killing a man in a drunken brawl, an act no one had witnessed and which might have remained hidden forever. But Thornton's ledger recorded it in exquisite detail, right down to the name of the victim, the brand of whiskey consumed, and the location of the buried body. Elias, racked with guilt and desperate for forgiveness, became one of Thornton's most loyal pawns. He worked the Thornton shipping routes, falsified delivery manifests, and even helped dispose of evidence when other parishioners went missing. Some didn't pay. Some tried to resist. They were never seen again. Their disappearances were always explained away by plague pirates or the treacherous waters of the Chesapeake Bay. In truth, many of them were buried in the orchard behind St. Bartholomew, beneath a line of apple trees that bore no fruit. But the system was not perfect, because while Father Thornton had ears in every parish eyes, in every tavern, and a knife behind every blessing, he underestimated the power of written words. And in 1742, someone began writing them. A servant girl at the rectory named Lydia Byrne, barely 16, had been raised in the church, taught to read and write by a kindly deacon who died mysteriously just weeks after Thornton's arrival. She was invisible to most, but she listened, and she recorded. every strange visitor, every late-night meeting, every whispered argument, and every unexplained disappearance. Lydia's journal would eventually become the foundation of the 1892 farmhouse discovery. But in the moment, it was something far more dangerous. A ticking bomb, hidden behind loose stones in the church cellar where no one thought to look. Not even Samuel Thornton, who prided himself on his ability to sniff out dissent. But Lydia was patient and quiet, and she knew that monsters rarely fear ghosts until they start speaking. He called it penitential stewardship, a theology of redemption through financial sacrifice. The victims were never told they were being blackmailed. Instead, they were offered opportunities to assist the church in its spiritual restoration, a phrase that appeared in nearly every letter Marcus and Samuel sent. The payments were framed as acts of atonement, diverted to church projects that never actually materialized. In this way, the sinners believed they were buying grace, not silence. They weren't cowards succumbing to threats. They were patrons of mercy, pillars of their faith. And it worked. Month after month, the payments came wrapped in wax-sealed envelopes, disguised as charitable donations or real estate investments, all channeled through phony church funds. And in return, the Thorntons offered not just silence, but protection, a tacit assurance that the worst parts of your soul would never see the light of day. But the network expanded faster than Father Thornton had anticipated. By 1736, two more parishes, St. Elizabeth in Leonardtown and Holy Trinity near Upper Marlborough, were welcoming newly ordained priests trained in Thornton's doctrines. The system was virtually self-sustaining. Young clergy burdened with debt or burdened with their own sins were vulnerable to manipulation. A whisper here, a favor there, a reminder that the church always forgives, as long as you confess to the right person. The Thorntons weren't just running a criminal network, they were building a religious intelligence organization, the first of its kind in America. By the winter of 1736, the Thorntons controlled the private confessions of more than 2,000 parishioners spread across 5 counties. Their ledger was a secret map, each entry marked with 3 annotations: type of sin, vulnerability, potential wealth, and still no one suspected the truth. Why did they suspect? The priests were generous. The churches flourished. No scandals were uncovered. Until 1737, that year, the confession of a woman named Eleanor Ashford nearly brought the whole operation to its knees. That obstacle was the Archdiocese of Baltimore. Unlike the relatively lax oversight that had allowed Thornton's scheme to flourish in rural parishes, the Archdiocese represented a centralized authority with stronger ties to Rome and more rigorous standards of clerical conduct. Any unusual patterns, such as sudden architectural renovations, spikes in parish donations, or an unusually high rate of confessions could trigger scrutiny. And scrutiny was the one thing Thornton's network could not survive. To navigate this challenge, Father Thornton devised what he called the Lay Brotherhood of St. Jude, a fictitious religious society supposedly devoted to evangelizing isolated communities and funding new church infrastructure across the colony. In truth, the Brotherhood was a shell and administrative smokescreen that funneled money from blackmail victims into priest training, confessional modifications, and surveillance operations. Letters bearing the Brotherhood seal arrived in Rome, and Baltimore, with glowing reports of revivalism in the American colonies, increased attendance. generous donations, and powerful testimonies of redemption. These communications, written in elegant Latin and bearing forged signatures from local bishops, served to deflect attention from the true source of their prosperity. But even with his expanding reach, Thornton knew the archdiocese wouldn't remain blind forever. The longer the system grew, the greater the risk of exposure. So, he introduced a fail-safe mechanism. Each parish operating under the Thornton method began creating redundant ledgers, copies of confession transcripts coded and encrypted but stored in separate hidden locations away from the churches. These were referred to in Thornton's letters as the keys of Peter, referencing the biblical authority to bind and loose. In reality, they were insurance policies, documents that could be used to threaten victims, destroy rival clergy, or buy silence if investigations began. It was during the creation of the second major key archive that the Eleanor Ashford affair began to unfold, a miscalculation so grave it nearly collapsed the entire operation. Eleanor, 33, was the daughter of a prominent slave trader and the widow of a wealthy planter. Sharp-minded and fiercely independent, she had always viewed confession with skepticism until a chance encounter with Samuel Thornton during a Holy Week service led to an unusual level of trust. Unlike her peers, Eleanor wasn't motivated by guilt, but by curiosity and a yearning for spiritual meaning that colonial society rarely offered women of her station. Her confession, delivered in April 1736, was the first that didn't contain blackmail material. It contained questions, and the answers Samuel provided, carefully worded and deceptively doctrinal, planted seeds of suspicion. Isabella's suspicions had become certainty. But rather than confront Father Thornton directly, she decided to uncover how he was accessing and weaponizing the content of her confessions. She knew the seal of confession was considered inviolable if Thornton was violating it. There had to be a method, something mechanical, structural. Her opportunity came in late February 1737 during a storm that damaged part of the church's eastern wall and forced St. Bartholomew's to close for repairs. With the church temporarily vacated and the priest away attending a spiritual retreat in Easton, Isabella used her family's influence to gain access under the pretense of inspecting water damage for her father, a major donor to the parish. What she found beneath the sanctuary changed the course of colonial Catholicism forever. Behind a concealed door in the sacristy's floor, Isabella descended into the substructure of the church, a narrow stone tunnel that led beneath the confessional booths. There, in a chamber, lined with dusty prayer books and rusted tools, she discovered a listening station. Tin tubes connected to the confessionals above were routed through the floor into small acoustic chambers, each marked with a parishioner's name in chalk. A makeshift desk bore several ciphered transcripts written in a spidery hand. Her hand. Her confessions word for word. Among the pages, she found references to the fabricated sins she'd confessed, each neatly summarized with annotations and risk assessments. But more horrifying was the discovery of a ledger, a thick leather-bound volume stamped with the symbol of the Brotherhood of St. Jude. Inside were records of dozens of parishioners, names, dates, sins, payment schedules, spiritual value assessments, and even projected compliance lifespans. Estimations of how long each person could be reliably exploited. Isabella knew immediately what she was holding: a blackmail registry disguised as pastoral care. Rather than take her findings to her father, Isabella did something far more dangerous. She copied the most damning pages into her own cipher and entrusted them to the only person she believed might be both sympathetic and powerful enough to act Bishop John Carroll, then an auxiliary bishop with a growing reputation for integrity. She dispatched her coded letter to Baltimore under the cover of a shipment of tobacco invoices. By the time Father Thornton returned to Havenwood, Isabella had resumed her role as pious and obedient daughter. She even confessed to a brief lapse in faith, claiming she'd questioned the necessity of confession itself. The priest, now suspicious, began preparing what he called a purification path for Isabella Ashford, a gentle euphemism for social ruin, marriage exile, or worse. But what Thornton didn't know was that Bishop Carroll had already begun the first secret audit of the Thornton parishes. She understood then that exposing Thornton wouldn't simply require proof, it would require protection strategy and allies within a system designed to protect men like him. By confronting him, she had crossed a line. The priest, cloaked in divine authority, had made it clear if she spoke out her family's name, and possibly their fortune would burn with her. But Isabella Ashford was not a girl easily silenced. That night, she began transcribing her entire investigation from the false confessions she had tested to the names of other parishes where Thornton's nephews operated. She outlined the mechanics of the blackmail system, her observations of altered sermons, and the pattern of rising charitable donations following confessions. Her account was supported by the ciphered transcripts she had secretly copied from the listening chamber weeks earlier. She bound it all in a small leather journal and encoded it using a variant of Vigenère cipher, a method she had learned while studying Renaissance cryptography. Then, in one final act of defiance, she enclosed the journal in a package addressed to Bishop John Carroll in Baltimore, marked as Theological Inquiry, Urgent. The following Sunday she attended Mass at St. Bartholomew's with perfect composure. Father Thornton gave a sermon on the dangers of pride and the sin of questioning divine authority. His eyes met Isabella's more than once during the homily, but her expression never wavered. 3 weeks later, Bishop Carroll responded not with a letter but with a visit. He arrived in Havenwood unannounced, accompanied by 2 church auditors and an assistant from the Jesuit College in Baltimore. Officially, the visit was framed as a routine inspection of parish finances and facilities, part of a broader audit of Maryland's colonial dioceses. But in private, Carroll requested to speak with Isabella at once. Their meeting, held behind closed doors in the Ashford Library, lasted nearly 4 hours. Isabella presented him with her evidence, explained her experiment, and perhaps most bravely expressed her fear that even the church might bury the truth to protect its own. But Bishop Carroll surprised her. "What you've uncovered," he said quietly, "could dismantle the moral authority of every Catholic parish in this colony. But it must be brought to light. The wheels of justice, however, would not turn quickly or safely." Carroll knew that a public accusation could spark rebellion, scandal, or even violence in an already tense colony. Instead, he authorized a clandestine investigation into all Thornton-affiliated parishes. Over the next 6 months, Jesuit auditors posing as clerics and builders infiltrated Marcus and Samuel Thornton's churches, examining the structure of their confessionals, listening for echo chambers and comparing parish donations with coded records found in hidden compartments. By autumn 1737, the evidence was overwhelming. Many of the names she recognized: wealthy merchants, respected landowners, even a few colonial officials. Each file contained detailed summaries of their sins, dates of their confessions, and notes written in a cipher she now partially understood thanks to her earlier studies. Some of the documents even included records of payments thinly disguised as donations, with marginal notations like compliant, resistant, or additional pressure required. Isabella knew that simply describing this archive would never be enough. She needed to extract physical evidence. Working by candlelight, she carefully selected the most damning materials, transcripts involving the colony's most powerful families, particularly those that linked confession directly to financial extortion. She included copies of her own false confessions and the sermons that followed, as well as correspondence between the Thornton priests, coded letters, which she could now prove to be part of a coordinated effort. But the most important discovery came in a slim, leather-bound ledger, marked simply with a cross. Inside was a master index of the Thornton network, a directory of each parish involved, the names of participating priests, and a chilling column labeled Assets and Leverage. This index catalogued each victim's net worth, known sins, social connections, and calculated risk scores. It was evidence not just of isolated corruption but of organized spiritual extortion on a scale that could shake the church to its foundations. Isabella copied as much as she could by hand using parchment and ink she had brought in a satchel beneath her cloak. She carefully resealed the documents she disturbed and exited the church before sunrise, returning home with a collection of transcriptions that would become known decades later as the Ashford Papers. With her evidence secured, Isabella enacted the final stage of her plan. She delivered the Ashford Papers to her cousin, Magistrate Thomas Ashford, along with a full written account of her investigation. At the same time, she wrote a second letter to Bishop Carroll, this time including direct citations from the Thornton ledger. Her tone was no longer that of a concerned parishioner. It was a formal complaint supported by irrefutable documentation invoking both canon law and colonial statutes. The church had no choice but to act. Within 2 weeks, Bishop Carroll convened a cloistered tribunal, a secret ecclesiastical court designed to investigate internal scandals without alerting the broader public. Jesuit auditors and canon lawyers were sent to each Thornton-affiliated parish under the pretext of conducting a spiritual census. Their true task: confirm the modified confessionals, locate hidden chambers, and secure additional records. By May of 1737, the Thornton operation had been dismantled. Marcus Thornton was found dead in the Eastern Rectory, an apparent suicide by poison. Though some suspected he had been silenced by associates seeking to protect themselves. Samuel Thornton fled his parish days before the auditors arrived and was never seen again, though rumors of sightings in the West Indies persisted for years. Father Thomas Thornton, however, was arrested, excommunicated, and transported to Rome under papal authority, where he faced charges before the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the same institution once known as the Inquisition. His trial remains one of the most heavily redacted cases in Vatican history. Isabella didn't hesitate. Before dawn, she disguised herself in a servant's cloak and slipped out the back of her family's estate, carrying only the most damning portions of her copied evidence and a concealed dagger for protection. Her destination wasn't Bishop Carroll in Baltimore. That route was too exposed. Instead, she rode hard for Annapolis, where her cousin, Magistrate Thomas Ashford, could provide both protection and the legal authority to act swiftly. By the time she arrived, Whitmore had died. The town physician had prepared to list the cause of death as sudden fever until Isabella placed a sealed envelope in his hand. Inside was a summary of what she had witnessed, the vial of arsenic, the confession transcripts, and a warning that more deaths would follow if immediate action wasn't taken. She then turned to her cousin and handed him the Ashford papers. Magistrate Ashford convened an emergency colonial tribunal under the authority of Governor Samuel Ogle. Within hours, warrants were issued for the arrest of Father Thomas Thornton, Samuel Thornton, and any known associates. But by the time the authorities reached Heavenwood, the rectory at St. Bartholomew had been burned to the ground. Thornton was gone. So was every document that hadn't been secured by Isabella. What followed was one of the most dramatic and controversial investigations in colonial religious history. Searches of multiple parishes uncovered remnants of the modified confessionals, encoded letters, and confession transcripts too numerous to destroy. Marcus Thornton's death in Easton, originally ruled a suicide, was reopened and officially reclassified as suspicious after matching poison was found in his study. Samuel Thornton's fate remained unknown, but rumors placed him on a merchant vessel, bound for the Caribbean, possibly under an assumed name. The Catholic Church was forced to respond. Bishop Carroll, under pressure from both the colonial government and the Vatican, suspended all Thornton-ordained priests and ordered a full ecclesiastical audit of Maryland's Catholic infrastructure. A Jesuit investigation team arrived from Rome under papal authority, and in a move nearly unheard of in colonial history, they declared the entire Thornton network heretical and formally excommunicated Father Thomas Thornton in absentia. But the real hero of the investigation remained hidden from public view. For her protection, Isabella Ashford was quietly sent to France, where she continued her theological studies under the protection of a Jesuit academic society. Though her name was omitted from official church records, letters preserved in family archives confirm that she corresponded for years with European reformers under the pseudonym Clara Veritas, the Light of Truth. Her bravery not only dismantled the most sophisticated blackmail ring in early American religious history, but also forced the Church to revise its confessional protocols, leading to the ban on mechanical enhancements to confessional booths that remains canon law to this day. And yet, even now, some questions remain. What happened to Father Thornton? Did Samuel rebuild the network elsewhere? Were there more victims listed in the files Isabella never copied? The Ashford Papers, copies of which reside today in the private archives of the Maryland Historical Society, end with a single line in Isabella's own hand. There is no darker blasphemy than turning repentance into a weapon. At exactly 200 p.m., as the iron bell of St. Bartholomew told Isabella Ashford entered the sanctuary in a modest, dark cloak, a leather satchel clutched in her gloved hands. Seated in the pews, scattered to appear incidental, were Thomas Ashford, Dr. Crawford, Margaret Whitmore, and near the back, hooded in his clerical robes, Bishop Carroll, flanked discreetly by two aides from the Baltimore Diocesan Tribunal. Father Thornton was already waiting at the altar, his expression unreadable. The priest's face, once so capable of warmth and persuasion, now looked pale and tight with anticipation. He gestured for Isabella to join him near the pulpit, and as she approached, their eyes locked predator and prey, though neither could yet be sure which was which. Miss Ashford, Thornton said in a low voice, I understand you're burdened with spiritual unrest. You chose a very public way to address it. I believe certain sins must be exposed in the light of day. Isabella replied, her voice carrying clearly in the sanctuary's vaulted acoustics, even those committed by men in collars. Thornton's smile was thin. Careful, child. The consequences of false accusations are nothing compared to the consequences of allowing a criminal conspiracy to continue poisoning our community. Isabella interrupted, drawing her satchel tightly to her chest. Before Thornton could reply, Thomas Ashford stood. This conversation is being heard by legal and ecclesiastical witnesses, he announced. You are being observed under the authority of both the colony and the church. Thornton's stiffened eyes narrowing. So this is a trial then? No, Father, Isabella said, stepping toward the altar. It's a confession. She pulled from her satchel the transcribed pages from the basement, the coded payment ledgers, and a diagram of the confessional system. This evidence confirms what I saw below this very sanctuary. A system designed not for redemption but surveillance. You've used the sacrament of confession to extract money, manipulate families, and, her voice caught, murder those who threaten to speak out. A sudden hush fell. From the rear pew, Bishop Carroll rose slowly. Father Thornton, do you deny the existence of these records? Do you deny the arsenic found in the basement storage or your recorded communications with your nephews about expanding this operation to Virginia? Thornton's calm shattered. This girl is deranged. These are forgeries. You would take her word over the sacred honor of your own priests. She's not alone, Dr. Crawford interjected. Her account of Mr. Whitmore's symptoms matches arsenic poisoning. I believe I may have been misled in my diagnosis, and I have no reason to doubt Miss Ashford's observations. You fools don't understand? Thornton's voice rose, desperate now. We created order control. We kept sin from spilling into the streets by harnessing it in secret. Without us, your parishes will fall into chaos. But you're not priests, Bishop Carroll said coldly. You're parasites, and you will be held accountable. As Carroll signaled to his aides, Thornton lunged, not for Isabella, but for the satchel still in her hands, perhaps hoping to destroy the documents, even in this final hour. But Isabella stepped back, with poise born from weeks of dread and preparation, and Thomas Ashford, anticipating the move, intercepted the priest and slammed him to the marble floor with the help of the bishop's guards. The sound of his body hitting the ground echoed like thunder through the sanctuary. Aftermath. In the days that followed, Father Thornton was excommunicated, then arrested by colonial authorities. He died awaiting trial under suspicious circumstances, poisoned by an unknown hand. Marcus Thornton had already been found dead in Easton, and Samuel Thornton was never seen again, though reports would surface of a Catholic missionary operating in the West Indies under a false name. The Thornton files, authenticated by both legal and religious authorities, were archived under seal. Only select pages would ever be released publicly enough to inform, but never to inspire imitation. Bishop Carroll initiated sweeping reforms. All confessionals in Maryland were inspected and dismantled if modified. Parish priests were subject to rotating appointments and periodic audits, and most notably, a decree from Rome would follow within the year, banning any structural or technological alterations to the confessional sacrament without express Vatican approval. Isabella Ashford, under papal protection, was quietly sent to Europe, first to France, then to Rome, where she advised the Holy Office on heresy and doctrinal abuse. Though her name faded from colonial memory, whispers of her bravery lived on in family legend and in the Ashford papers she entrusted to her cousin. They remained hidden for centuries until someone, perhaps you, finds them again. Isabella took a steady breath and allowed a brief silence to settle between them. The weight of Father Thornton's words, his confidence, his threats, his unrepentant confession hung in the air like incense before a fire. And then she smiled. Thank you, Father," she said, her voice ringing with a quiet triumph. That was exactly what I needed. From the shadows behind the last row of pews, Bishop Carroll stepped forward, his mitre casting a solemn silhouette against the grey light. Thomas Ashford. Dr. Crawford and Margaret Whitmore emerged from their hidden vantage points, their faces grim with what they had just heard. Father Thornton turned his expression a mask of fury and disbelief. "You were never alone with me," Isabella said softly. "You never had the upper hand." The bishop's voice broke the tense silence. "Father Thornton, your words have been heard and your crimes recorded. I hereby place you under immediate ecclesiastical arrest, pending formal excommunication and transfer to civil authorities." "Are you self-righteous fools?" Thornton snarled, spinning toward the bishop. "Do you think you can dismantle what I've built? We control the wealth of half this colony. The church exists here because of me." "No," Bishop Carroll said firmly. "It exists in spite of you, and now it will survive without you." Thornton lunged, whether for Isabella or for the folder in her hand was unclear, but he never reached either. Thomas Ashford moved swiftly, intercepting him with a forceful shove that knocked the disgraced priest to the ground. The guards accompanying the bishop moved in, restraining Thornton with iron manacles reserved for the most dangerous heretics. Aftermath. Father Thomas Thornton was taken under church custody and later handed over to colonial authorities, where he faced both ecclesiastical trial and civil prosecution for his crimes. The evidence Isabella had gathered, transcripts, coded correspondence, and eyewitness testimony, was irrefutable. Within 6 months, St. Bartholomew's was closed indefinitely. Its confessionals were dismantled. The basement chamber was sealed and later destroyed by order of the bishop. An official inquiry led by Bishop Carroll and Governor Ogle uncovered over 40 cases of extortion, with at least 5 suspicious deaths linked to Thornton and his nephews. Marcus Thornton's body was discovered in a shallow grave near Easton, murdered, authorities believed, by one of his own blackmail victims. Samuel Thornton disappeared last seen boarding a vessel bound for the West Indies. A warrant for his arrest remained outstanding for decades. Isabella Ashford became a controversial figure. Some praised her as a heroine, others, bound by fear or allegiance to corrupted clergy, branded her a liar and a danger to the church. But her actions forced a reckoning. Confessional protocols across the colonies were reformed. The Vatican quietly issued a papal decree banning mechanical alterations to confessionals. Colonial priests were rotated regularly to prevent any one man from accumulating unchecked power. And Isabella, she declined all offers of marriage, instead traveling to Rome to continue her theological studies. She later became one of the first women to serve as an advisor to the congregation for the doctrine of the faith under a pseudonym. Her reports shaped church policy on the use of confession, religious authority, and safeguards against abuse. She never returned to Maryland. Nearly 300 years later, renovations at a historic church in Annapolis unearthed a sealed chest behind the altar, hidden beneath layers of brickwork. Inside were copies of Isabella's original letters, a set of cipher keys, and a diary written in her own hand. A local historian brings them to you unsure of their meaning. The church has offered to purchase the documents quietly, but now you know what they're hiding. The revelations shook colonial Maryland to its core. What began as whispered suspicions in a quiet seaside parish had blossomed into one of the largest ecclesiastical scandals in colonial history. The Thornton network, as newspapers would later call it, became synonymous with both the depths of clerical corruption and the power of a single voice raised in defiance. The aftermath. In the months following Father Thornton's death, a sweeping investigation, jointly led by Bishop Carroll and Magistrate Ashford, resulted in the immediate arrest of multiple priests and lay associates connected to the Thornton operation, including those who facilitated coded correspondence or collected payments on the priest's behalf. The seizure of financial ledgers, confession transcripts, and a cipher keybook hidden behind a false altar panel in St. Joseph's, which confirmed that at least 31 parishes had been targeted for infiltration. Testimonies from over 60 victims, many of whom came forward after Isabella's story was made public, now emboldened to confess their own blackmail under the false belief that it had once been charitable penance. Many victims were prominent merchants, magistrates, landowners, and widows. Their secrets recorded exploited and used to control economic life in the Chesapeake region. Some paid willingly, having been convinced it was for the good of the church. Others had tried to withdraw and suffered mysterious illnesses, disappearances, or ruinous scandal. The fate of the Thorntons. Father. Marcus Thornton's body, discovered months earlier in Easton, was formally exhumed and identified, confirming his role in constructing the modified confessionals. Samuel Thornton, whose last known movement was to Port Royal, Jamaica, was declared a fugitive under international warrant. Rumors of his presence would continue for decades from Spanish Florida to Haiti, but he was never found. Several lower-ranking clergy, many of whom had benefited financially without knowing the full scope, were reassigned, defrocked, or imprisoned after being questioned under oath. Isabella Ashford. Her role in exposing the conspiracy made Isabella a symbol of courage and reform. The Catholic Church issued a rare public apology, signed by the Archbishop of Baltimore and endorsed by Rome, affirming that no priest, no matter his rank or status, may exploit the seal of confession for worldly power. A new canon law, dubbed the Ashford Edict, was passed strictly prohibiting any mechanical alterations to confessionals, mandating external oversight of parish funds, and installing a rotating clergy system to prevent similar abuses. Though some accused her of sedition or usurping male authority, Isabella was honored privately by the Vatican and offered a position as a theological consultant under a pseudonym. She never married, but lived a long life in Rome as a scholar and advisor, publishing under the name S. Haven, a quiet nod to her hometown. Her writings influenced the Church's approach to moral psychology, confession, and female theology, long before women were ever allowed public voice in such matters. Legacy. Today, a modest plaque at the entrance of St. Bartholomew's, now a museum, reads, "In memory of Isabella Ashford, 1718 and 1783, whose courage and clarity of conscience saved a community from corruption cloaked in faith. May truth always be heard, even when whispered in the dark." Her story once nearly silenced lives on in sermons, ethics courses, and historical fiction. It remains a chilling reminder that even sacred spaces can harbor shadows, and that sometimes one voice, sharp, unyielding, and true, can expose them all. A colonial reckoning. In London, news of the scandal prompted Parliament to quietly commission an internal review of Catholic institutions operating in the American colonies. Though Britain had long regarded Catholicism with suspicion, the Thornton case provided tangible evidence of systemic abuse that many Protestant critics used to justify harsher restrictions. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself issued a rare public statement. "Let this be a warning, not only to Catholics but to all who wear robes of authority, that the corruption of conscience beneath holy vestments is no less a crime than the theft of coin from a king." In the colonies, Protestant governors and magistrates, already wary of Catholic influence, used the scandal to push for increased government oversight of all religious institutions, mandatory public accounting of parish finances, and in some places, bans on private confessionals. This backlash nearly crushed Maryland's fragile religious pluralism, only held in balance by Bishop Carroll's public repentance and the reforms he instituted in the wake of the trials. The Ashford Reforms. At the center of those reforms was a series of canonical and civil changes, known collectively as the Ashford Reforms, implemented between 1737 and 1740. Architectural transparency. All confessionals were required to have open lattice designs with no direct sound channels. Hidden chambers were outlawed under penalty of excommunication. Third-party oversight. A council of lay auditors, including women, was established to review parish expenditures, especially those collected under charitable designations. Clerical rotation mandate. Priests could not remain at the same parish for more than 6 years to prevent the build-up of undue social or political power. Whistleblower protection. Isabella's case led to the creation of the canon of moral witness, granting immunity to individuals who exposed crimes committed under the guise of spiritual authority. These reforms, though initially resisted, would become a model for ethical church governance throughout the colonies, and eventually influence Catholic reform efforts in Europe as well. Isabella Ashford's legacy. Isabella's life after the trials was complex. Though she declined any official position within the church, she remained a lifelong advisor to Bishop Carroll, wrote 4 theological essays under pseudonyms, and was quietly consulted by Rome during the drafting of Doctrine 128, which formally addressed the misuse of confession. In 1745, she published a widely circulated essay under the pen name Vera Lux titled Truth in the Confessional, a treatise on conscience power and the limits of clergy, anonymously praised by clerics across Europe. Despite repeated marriage offers, Isabella never wed. She retired to a small house near St. Mary's City, where she taught girls to read Latin and Greek, and kept a meticulously annotated copy of St. Augustine's Confessions on her bedside table. She died in 1783, the same year as the Treaty of Paris. Her funeral, held quietly at dawn, by a small group of friends, and former students was attended by both Catholic and Protestant mourners. No clergy officiated. By her request, a single line was etched on her gravestone. Let conscience speak even when silence is safer. Enduring impact. Law schools in the early United States would later cite the Thornton case as one of the first documented examples of white-collar conspiracy and forensic psychological manipulation. Women's rights advocates in the 19th century would rediscover Isabella's writings and name her a proto-suffragist for her refusal to yield to patriarchal intimidation. Today, the Ashford collection containing facsimiles of the coded documents transcripts and Isabella's original notes is preserved at the Library of Congress and frequently studied by historians of law, religion, and gender. The Thornton scandal deepened Protestant suspicions of Catholic loyalty and provided ammunition for those who argued that Catholics could not be trusted with positions of authority in colonial society. These tensions would persist into the Revolutionary period and beyond, shaping debates around religious liberty, clerical accountability, and the eventual push for separation of church and state. Bishop Carroll then enacted sweeping reforms aimed at preventing similar abuses. These reforms included mandatory inspections of all church building projects, regular rotation of priests between parishes, new financial oversight procedures to ensure transparency. But a deeper, more troubling question remained unanswered. How do we guard against the abuse of religious authority while preserving the sacred trust necessary for pastoral care? The physical renovations that the Thorntons had made to their church were dismantled. Yet the churches themselves remained in use, silent witnesses to the crimes that had flourished within their walls. At St. Bartholomew's, many parishioners reported that they felt uncomfortable going to confession for years after the scandal. In the spring of 1738, Marcus Thornton was executed after being convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and multiple counts of extortion. Samuel Thornton, though acquitted because of his age and apparent lesser role, was sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that ended mysteriously less than 2 years later, when he died under circumstances some considered suspicious. The broader implications of the Thornton plot have reverberated for decades. The case has become a landmark in debates about the limits of the clergy privilege, the responsibility of secular authorities to intervene in religious matters, and the vulnerability of even the most sacred institutions to corruption. Legal scholars have cited the Thornton trials when arguing for the state's right to investigate churches. The case set a precedent for how religious powers could and should be held accountable. Isabella Ashford, for all her courage, never spoke publicly about her role in exposing the plot. She eventually married Jonathan Pierce, although their wedding was delayed for nearly a year as the legal and social fallout was worked out. In private letters discovered after her death in 1782, Isabella often pondered the cost of her actions. I sometimes wonder, she wrote in 1745, whether the truth is worth the lives it has taken and the faith it has destroyed. But then, I remember the agony of Richard Whitmore, and I know that some evils must be faced whatever the consequences. Her words underscored a cruel truth. Justice often exacts the heaviest price from those brave enough to pursue it. In the tobacco fields of colonial Maryland, beneath the silent shadow of St. Bartholomew, Isabella's legacy lives on a testament to the belief that no government, whether religious or secular, can escape accountability for betraying the people it claims to serve. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Thornton affair, however, is not what has been revealed, but what may still be hidden. Among the encrypted files recovered from the three churches are repeated references to other networks operating in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and the Carolinas. Despite extensive investigation, no arrests have been made. No other networks have been formally discovered, and so historians must wonder, how many more secrets remain buried in the foundations of America's oldest churches? The final entry in Father Thomas Thornton's encrypted diary, deciphered months after his death, contained only a cryptic warning. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Was this the deathbed boast of a delusional man, or a signal to his accomplices who had evaded justice and may have continued their work in the shadows? That question remains one of colonial America's darkest and most enduring mysteries. What do you think? Is everything really out in the Thornton case? Or are there still secrets waiting to be uncovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this dark journey into America's hidden past, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Click the notification bell so you never miss a new story. Share this video with anyone who loves historical conspiracy theories and forgotten horrors.